Professor, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here today. I feel very honoured that you asked me to give an address at the outset of such an important conference. I'm very grateful to Stuart Pickett for his warm words of introduction. Stuart and I are both, as you've heard, from Scotland. Stuart has many hats to wear, and one of the most important is as a minister of the Church of Scotland. But Scotland today, like many countries, has seen a falling away of its Christian belief system. Many Scots are unlikely to be addressed by a minister of the Church of Scotland, such as Stuart, on more than 3 occasions in life, at birth, betrothal and burial. But I think I would feel extremely blessed if I had started my last journey in life at a service conducted by Stuart. Despite falling congregations, it must be remembered that Scotland has many reasons to be thankful to its clergy. They have left an indelible mark on our own history and the stories of many countries throughout the world. It always strikes me as paradoxical and even perverse that a race such as the Scots should have been so diligent in building up the British Empire as they were in providing the impetus that actually led to its destruction. And you'll find they served with distinction as both soldiers and school teachers. And as Saint-Just suggests, the former, of course, creating the very order that the work of the latter would disrupt and undo. But the legacy of the dual purpose of colonialism is not so straightforward. And occasionally I've played with the idea that there must be a pedagogical justification for imposing the values of one civilization upon another. But as you're well aware, there are very strong counter-arguments to such a thought. But the truth is that the pattern of osmosis and absorption of ideas and cultural values follows many strands, and it is the study of this process which is so fascinating. I'm reminded of the story of the senior United Nations official, and there are many in the audience, I have to be careful what I say, who visited Sierra Leone to inspect the UNPROFOR mission, and he found himself in conversation with 2 very bulky senior British non-commissioned officers. They were both wearing the distinctive red hackle of the famous Black Watch Regiment. But he was puzzled that neither were native Scots. Both had come obviously from the South Pacific. They explained to him that they visited Scotland with a Samoan rugby team, and instead of returning home after the end of the tournament, they decided to extend their visas and join a famous Scottish regiment. They'd both be welcomed with open arms into the Black Watch. The official was very puzzled, and he said, "How can you serve in such an illustrious military unit without the appropriate heritage of birth and upbringing? You obviously don't even have a drop of Scottish blood in your veins." So in reply, the senior Samoan sergeant drew himself up and towered over the UN official and said, "You forget. In the 19th century, the Church of Scotland sent missionaries to Samoa, and we ate them all." When the American colonies revolted in 1776, it was Charles James Fox, a British politician, who remarked laconically that it was a pity that cousin America should have eloped with a Scotch clergyman. And he was, of course, referring to John Witherspoon, the 6th president of Princeton College, who fed successive classes of future American patriots, passing through his lecture hall on a diet of Scottish Enlightenment studies. 60 years later, the Reverend Alexander Duff led the first Church of Scotland mission to India. But in doing so, he inadvertently helped to light the flame of the Indian independence movement. He established a school for Bengali children in Kolkata in 1835, the Scottish Church College, a school which would become celebrated as the alma mater of the early National Congress Party, and successively of many leading nationalists who hastened the end of British rule and founded the Indian state. And turning to China, it was the Scottish missionary James Legge, one of the finest sinologists of his generation, who prepared for a lifetime translating Confucian texts by reading divinity at Aberdeen University. His protege, Wang Tao, accompanied Legge from Hong Kong to Scotland in 1867, and is recognized as the most influential Chinese journalist of his generation. He published the first Chinese language newspaper, the Universal Circulating Herald, in 1874, and assisted Sun Yat-sen in codifying its revolutionary ideals. So both in India and in China, there was a deep connection with the experience of colonialism. But the story of Japan's absorption of Western influence in the second half of the 19th century offers a very different perspective on the transmission of ideas and values. Although Japan found itself responding rapidly to economic and social changes driven by external forces, its right to exist as a nation was largely respected by the colonial powers. It's a very revealing exercise to read the impressions recorded by European and American visitors to Japan in the 1850s. In the climacteric year 1858, diplomatic missions were sent to Japan from the United States, Russia, France, and the Netherlands, each country signing a treaty of amity and commerce. The British mission, as Stuart has told you, was led by my great-great-grandfather, James Bruce, the 8th Lord Elgin. And as a result of this family connection, in October last year, I was invited to attend the celebrations marking the 150th anniversary of the formation of the first treaty port, Yokohama, one of the first of the 5 ports which came into existence as a result of the treaty. My host asked me to tell the story of this early connection, this encounter between East and West, and I was able to do so making use of my ancestors' own correspondence and a set of original watercolors you see here, which were exhibited in Yokohama. The mission that he led only lasted for 3 weeks, but the evidence which he collected gave a startling insight into a society that had been effectively closed to the West for 230 years. There's no doubt that the arrival of Western missions marked a sudden and profound moment for Japan. In the ensuing 50 years, there developed a remarkable convergence between Britain and Japan, the former seeking to influence the economic development of its new trading partner. And I thought it would be a useful datum point for this conference to trace the evolution of this relationship from its very source. It was after he concluded the Treaty of Tianjin with the Chinese government in July 1858 that Lord Elgin took the opportunity to lead a diplomatic mission to Japan. He was unusually well qualified to undertake this mission. He had already served as the Governor of Jamaica and significantly as Governor General of Canada. In Canada, he witnessed and participated in some of the most tumultuous political events in that country's history. He survived 2 assassination attempts. My Canadian friends never believed me when I told them this. He played a hugely important role in setting Canada on the road to democratic government. During his term of office, he intervened to snuff out an annexation movement which would have subsumed Canada into the United States. He introduced responsible government, and he enabled the province of Canada, which was Ontario and Montreal, to become the first self-governing colony in the British Empire. It was a vital precursor to Confederation in 1867, an ultimate nationhood. In 1854, he negotiated a free trade treaty with Washington, which my Canadian friends tell me has never been bettered. And having led 2 Allied expeditions to China in 1857 and 1860, he eventually ended his career as Viceroy of India, and he lies buried where he died in 1863 in Dharamsala in the Himalayas. This is a picture taken 10 years later in 1857. The first picture was taken in Nova Scotia in 1847. This is the aging process of running Canada. In the spring of 1857, Elgin was dispatched to China to negotiate a treaty which would allow British traders privileged access to Chinese markets. He sailed with a task force of 2,000 troops and planned to rendezvous with a French expeditionary force. But while he was replenishing in Singapore, he heard of a serious uprising in India that threatened the whole security of the British Raj. And with no time to confirm with London, he took a decision to divert his entire task force to Kolkata instead of Canton and delay his Chinese mission indefinitely. So by the time he arrives in Nagasaki in August 1858, he had already been credited with preventing the loss of Britain's most important possession, India, and for securing a treaty with the Chinese, therefore vastly extending the area of influence of Britain in the Far East. Next slide. This is the painting commemorating the Treaty of Tianjin. His role as a diplomat in the age of gunboat diplomacy conceals a very complex man. He was profoundly troubled by the opium trade that underpinned British commercial expansion in the Far East. In Singapore, he had been shown an opium den and was appalled by the evidence of addiction that he discovered. He was a man of deep Christian conscience and had the greatest difficulty reconciling the remorseless advance of imperialism with his own privately held values. Often he found himself disgusted with the behaviour of British merchants whom he'd been instructed to protect and support. He wrote, "I have found them in the East among populations too timid to resist and too ignorant to complain. I have an instinct within me which loves righteousness and hates iniquity, and all this keeps me in a perpetual boil." But it was more in sorrow than in anger on his homeward voyage in 1858. He wrote of this abominable East, abominable not so much in itself as because it is strewed all over with the evidence of our violence and fraud and disregard of right. But in negotiating Britain's first treaty with Japan, his instructions from the British Foreign Minister, Lord Elgin, were very clear, and certainly rested more easily on his conscience. Clarendon said, "It's not the intention of Her Majesty's government to impose a new treaty on Japan by forcible means. We wish to conciliate the goodwill of the government and people of Japan. We have no cause for quarrel, to justify our having recourse to coercive measures, and least of all, in order to compel them to conclude a treaty, the provisions of which might be repugnant to their wills or interests." In keeping with this spirit of instructions, Lord Elgin set off with a modest fleet of only 3 ships. They took with them a steam yacht, which was destined as a gift for the Emperor of Japan. There was a certain amount of confusion about this gift. It was a beautiful yacht. It was fitted out inside with bird's eye maple and emerald silk. But, of course, it was never used by the Emperor. They completely misunderstood how Japan was run. And, in fact, Lord Elgin's secretary said to him at the time that the yacht was handed over, "We might as well have brought a wife for the Pope." It was a singularly inappropriate gift. The relatively small size of his force had much to do with the gamble that the news of his success in Canton and Tianjin would have reached Japan ahead of him. It's also possible that he intended to offer a clear contrast to the size of the American force led by Commodore Perry. The British mission set out from Shanghai on the 31st of July and arrived at Nagasaki Bay on August the 3rd. Here the mission disembarked, and Elgin recorded his first impression of Japan. He thought Nagasaki was wonderfully clean after China. Not a beggar to be seen. The people are clean too. For one of the commonest sights is to see a lady in front of her house, in the front room, wide open to the street, sitting in a tub, washing herself. Although the British party only stayed in Nagasaki for 2 days, they were able to observe the development of a new naval dockyard. In the workshops operated by Dutch contractors, they found Japanese apprentices learning technical and drafting skills. And here Elgin made an extraordinary prescient observation. The Japanese are competent to manage their own steam engines and to navigate their own ships. They're extremely sensitive and being suggested incapable of acquiring any branch of knowledge which is possessed by others, and have a high estimate of their powers in this respect. The British left Nagasaki on the 5th of August and sailed for Shimoda. It was here that Elgin met Townsend Harris, the US Consul General. He had recently arrived from Edo, which was the name of Tokyo at that time. And there the American and Dutch treaties had just been signed. Harris explained that news of Chinese capitulation at Canton and Tianjin had arrived in Japan like a lightning bolt. And Elgin then realized that his instinct of arriving lightly armed was correct. He concluded that Harris had contrived to make a pretty good treaty with Japan, evidently under the influence of the contre-coup of our proceedings in China. But the enormity of the task that lay ahead of him now dawned. Essentially, he was faced by 3 difficulties. How to make a treaty without time, for I cannot stay here for more than a few days, or interpreter, or credentials. Prestige is everything in the East, and I should not like